Hey guys, welcome back to Listen Champ for the second part of my video on who contributed the most to win World War II. Today I'm gonna talk about the other part of the war, the Asia-Pacific theater. Usually we call it the Pacific theater since the large part of the war took place between Japan and the United States in the Pacific, but it did not stop there. Japan's conquest in East Asia meant war against the Allies there. Of course, we know they began the invasion of China in 1937, that was a major theater, and they also tried pushing to India, so they fought the British and Imperial troops in the jungles there. One interesting thing in the last few years is that Beijing is not only celebrating the Chinese communist effort against Japan, but also the nationalist effort. Xi Jinping's government goes even further by claiming China did most of the fighting, justifying it by saying most Japanese divisions were there, and thus it was a main front. This is mostly for bolstering his One China policy, and to be a moral foundation for Beijing's global power. It's kinda like the Soviet claim, except the Soviets actually destroyed most of the Germans' land forces, while the Chinese did not. You also have some people today saying the main factor in Japan's surrender was not the atomic weapons, but rather the Soviet entry into the war at the same time. Let's examine what really happened. My structure here will be similar to my previous video. I'll talk about the Allied war effort, and boy, I have stories on the Chinese. Then Japanese strengths and losses, naval warfare, the air war, which was a major component in the theater, Lend-Lease to China, the Soviet part in the war from 1938 to 1940 and in 1945, and finally the reasons which pushed Japan to surrender before its territory was invaded. So just a quick reminder of the events. The Japanese already took Chinese territories in the 1930s, and in July 1937 began a full-scale invasion. They took huge swaths of territory and inflicted large casualties on the Chinese. After their advance stalled in the spring of 1941, they focused on the Americans and other Western allies, leaving the bulk of their army in China, but taking their best units for battles in the Pacific Islands and Burma. As we know, in December 1941 they attacked Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaya, Burma, and other places. They made impressive conquests on land and on sea, eventually knocking on Australia's door. In the next few years, they fought the Americans in Pacific Islands and in impressive naval and air battles like Midway. They battled the British to reach India and kept pressure on China. Progressively, the Allies strangled them, recaptured territories, and as the Americans bombed two cities with atomic weapons and the Soviets began invading Manchuria, Japan finally surrendered on August 15. So that's as short as I could make it. When I said that strengths and losses for allied countries were not a good indicator of performance in defeating an enemy, the Chinese are perhaps the best example. I must warn you, it's very hard to get reliable numbers for the Asian theater. Chinese losses were second only to the Soviets in World War II. We're talking about 4 million military casualties, which includes prisoners, and 14 million civilian deaths, compared to 112,000 American military deaths. As with the Soviets, Chinese division strengths were inferior to the Western Allies. One thing we must understand, Chinese forces were far from homogeneous. As the Japanese invaded China, the country was in the midst of another civil war between the nationalist Kuomintang faction, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the communist faction, led by Mao Zedong. Officially they declared a truce and set to fight the Japanese together, when in fact, communist war efforts were pretty limited, especially at the beginning. So when I say Chinese, I will mainly mean Chiang's forces. Chiang managed the impressive feat of uniting warlord factions and armies under one flag, so his forces ranged from loyal and trained to disloyal and untrained. 14 million Chinese men were conscripted from 1937 to 1945, and most of them had no proper training or equipment. In 1937, Chiang's army was made of 380,000 loyal troops, 520,000 normally loyal men, 300,000 provincial semi-autonomous troops who could be called, and the rest were independent. The communists in 1937 had 45,000 men, and up to 80,000 if we counted guerrillas. On paper, a Chinese division was 10,000 strong, but the Chinese only had about 20 divisions of that size in 1937, 10 of them which were trained by the Germans in the 1930s. The 200 other divisions were about 5,000 to 6,000 strong. In comparison, a US Army Infantry Division in the Pacific had more than 14,000 men, and the Marine Division ranged up to 20,000 men. And I'll talk more about military equipment a bit more later, but here are a few facts. In 1937, the Chinese had about 3,000 vehicles in total. Yes, 3,000. In 1941, they had 800 artillery guns. Yes. Their armor were mostly tankettes, and tanks were the Renault FT-17, yes, the Great War tank, and 88 T-26 furnished by the Soviets. In December 1942, the Chinese had 1,300 artillery pieces, 7,800 trench mortars, 6,000 trucks of which half were functional, and even then they lacked roads and oil. Just an example, to counter Operation Ishigo in 1944, the 93rd Chinese Army took 2 months to go from Sichuan to Guangxi. Already we can see the kind of army it was. And if you thought the Soviets were inefficient, boy, it's on another level here. Well, firstly, the Chinese front was large but not very intense for the Japanese. After Pearl Harbor, both nationalists and communists realized victory was inevitable and decided to focalize on the post-war and save their strength as much as possible. The Japanese, after the advance stalled in the spring of 1941 and after their campaign in reaction to the Doolittle raid in April 1942, did not initiate a major offensive until Ishigo in 1944. As mentioned earlier, Chinese forces were often territorial, morale was low, and corruption high. Quick example, as US advisors tried to set up an artillery training center, they had to deal with the arrest of their construction foreman by the local Chinese commander, they had to buy supplies at ridiculous prices, and the electrical system was damaged when another commander tried to steal electricity with a steel wire for his house. Most units did not have artillery or motorized vehicles, and supplies were allocated in function of loyalty. In general, supplies were very low, all equipment was lacking, and as each officer took a cut of the men's pay, soldiers didn't receive much. As they were trained in India by British and American forces, Chinese soldiers quickly gained weight and were surprised to receive full pay.
You guys are getting paid?
And you can add to that self-inflicted disasters like the infamous Yellow River flooding. In 1938, the Chinese destroyed several dikes on the Yellow River, attempting to slow down the Japanese army, but it's estimated it killed about 400,000 to 500,000 civilians, which is several times the number for the Japanese massacre at Nanking. Having these problems on their own front was something, but the British and Americans quickly saw in Burma how it applied there. In Burma, by the way, the Chinese in 1944 had 40,000 men, and their impact was hard to measure because they were largely less efficient than Western units. The British 14th Army, dubbed the Forgotten Army, was one of the largest units of the war with nearly 1 million men in late 1944, mostly Indian troops. The thing with the Chinese was they lost enormously in 1937, so they were very reluctant to send men in Burma, even if it was to regain supply routes for their own country. Often promised units would not come, and when they did, they were often led by inept loyalists. When Chinese generals were competent, like General Sun, subordinates were often not. General To, at the head of the Chinese Fifth Army, mastered the art of temporizing. General Alexander, then at the head of the British forces there, once visited To and asked where the artillery guns were. To replied that the Fifth Army was the best Chinese army since it had artillery guns, so therefore he could not risk them in battle. And if it wasn't enough, Chinese soldiers were so desperate for supplies that they would sometimes steal the water from radiators in British trucks supplying them. And talking about military performance, while Chiang managed to bring different factions into an army, he didn't trust his own forces. As American General Stilwell was to take control of Chinese forces in Burma in 1942, Chiang explained to him how to use them. He said they could not be expected to hold the proper line, so he advised Stilwell to stack them one behind the other, so when a Japanese attack came, they would smash units until they grew tired. Otherwise, Chinese strategy and tactics suffered from a tendency to try to cover all points evenly and commit forces piecemeal, hence inviting defeat in detail. Staff officers had no authority to transmit orders and they had to come directly from commanders. Communications were horrible, and it was estimated the Chinese division could only defend about 12 miles of front without losing contact with its own headquarters. To illustrate this, let me develop on Operation Ishigo, which began in April 1944 and lasted until the end of the year. It was the largest Japanese operation of the war in China, as 17 divisions massed against the Chinese. 300,000 Chinese troops just vanished after hearing the magnitude of what was to come. Japanese forces of 500 men could dislocate entire Chinese divisions, with officers stealing transports to flee with their families. In fact, Ishigo achieved almost all its objectives. American airfields, the main targets, were put out of action. That did not matter much by that time since the Americans had recaptured Clark Field in the Philippines and sealed off Formosa Strait from the east. The rail link across China was secure for the Japanese, and the nationalists lost over 500,000 men, a quarter of their remaining industrial base, and the agricultural resources of Hunan, and Guangxi. It didn't matter at that point since American forces were closing in on Japan. Okay, and to cap this part, let me tell you perhaps the most Chinese thing of the war. The Chinese were surprised by Japan's surrender, and they were unprepared even to arrange transportation for surrender delegations. And like I said, transportation was so bad that the Chinese... they had to ask the Japanese to maintain order in occupied areas until they arrived. So in light of all this, I think it's fair to say China was saved mainly thanks to its size and numbers and the Western war effort. How much each country contributed? Let's look at it right now. Japanese strengths and losses are pretty hard to measure. There are differing accounts, and there is no monthly data for divisions like I had for the Germans. I'll show you the numbers I have. Japanese divisions nominally were around 25 to 28,000 men, and that's big, but again their true strengths varied. In early 1940, they had about 27 divisions in China and 12 in Manchuria. In December 1941, so at the beginning of the Pacific War, they had 38 divisions in China and Manchuria together, and sent 11 of their best divisions, along with 800 planes, to take Pacific Islands. The Burmese front began with 4 Japanese divisions and culminated with 10. In November 1943, they had 32 divisions in China, but 5 were taken for other fronts the following month. Japanese forces in the Pacific peaked at 24 divisions in August 1944. In November of that year, Okamura, the Japanese commander-in-chief in China, had 25 divisions in China and Manchuria, plus independent brigades. And that number stayed until the end of the war. For Ishigo, 17 divisions fought with 800 tanks and 240 planes. So we see they had the largest number of divisions against the Chinese throughout the war, but that forces sent to other fronts were considerable. One thing we must remember is that it only accounts for army divisions and not the Japanese Navy, which was just as important. For Japanese losses, it depends on sources but revolves around these numbers. According to John Ellis, who published the World War II Statistical Survey book, the Japanese had 1,834,000 military deaths, including 388,000 in China, 211,000 in Southeast Asia, so mainly Burma, and the rest in the Pacific, which includes 300,000 sailors. John Dower in War Without Mercy said 1,741,000 killed, including 396,000 in China. The Australia-Japanese Research Project put it at 2,121,000 deaths, with almost 456,000 in China. Japanese statistics said their losses in China in 1937 to 1941 were more than 185,000 dead, including 48,000 by disease, and 203,000 in 1941 to 1945. I mentioned the Soviets. Well, let's not forget they fought the Japanese in 1939, notably at the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, and in the last days of the war. Japanese deaths against them were 20 to 25,000 in 1939, and in 1945 the numbers varied greatly. The Japanese said about 21,000 and the Soviets said almost 84,000. So if I put the estimates with ranges, it looks like this. China in yellow, no joke intended, the Soviets in red, and the Western Allies in blue. It's pretty surprising if we only take the number of divisions into account, but remember, the Western Allies single-handedly fought the Japanese Navy with its hundreds of thousands of men, and they were much more efficient than the Chinese in fighting on land. Still, there is no denying China played an important part. Their contribution was very considerable, and they held up great numbers of Japanese throughout the war. I mentioned the naval war and said it was single-handed. Well, I meant it. Yep, the US sank 611 military and 2,117 merchant ships, with tonnage sunk at 1,822,000 for warships and 7,900,000 for merchants. That's the vast majority of Japanese losses. The Americans were responsible for every Japanese aircraft carrier sunk. Only at Truk in February 1944, they sunk 200,000 tons. The Chinese Navy, meanwhile, in 1937 they had 59 ships, including 6 light cruisers, so below 3,600 tons, 30 gunboats, and the rest were transports. This fleet was destroyed at the beginning of the war in 1937, and in fact the Japanese raised several sunken ships and used them afterwards. Air warfare, meanwhile, it's very complex and interesting in this case. It's also very hard to quantify because in battles in China, the Japanese would say they lost about 30 planes and the Chinese would say they shot down 300, so aviation was absolutely essential, both in the Pacific because islands were sparse, and on land because of the lack of transport infrastructure. Most Japanese aviation was used against the Americans. During the war, Japan produced 33,405 fighter planes, 9,558 attack planes, 11,943 bombers, and several thousand others for a total of almost 65,000. By the time of Pearl Harbor, they had 1,530 planes, including 400 deployed in China. In the Pacific, Japanese planes went from 2,520 in January 1942 to 4,600 in July 1945, with a few hundred in China. In March 1945, they had about 6,500 planes altogether, including 441 in China. That's a quick look at the Japanese war effort, but let's talk more about the Chinese. In 1937, they had on paper 500 planes, but of those, around 230 were airworthy. In July to November 1937, China destroyed 94 enemy planes and lost 131. That's when the Soviet Union stepped in. From 1937 to 1940, they were China's main aircraft supplier with 563 fighter planes and 322 bombers. They also sent pilots to help, and from 1938 to 1940, their forces destroyed 81 enemy planes and damaged 114. Chinese peak strength was 300 fighters and 100 bombers, but it fell rapidly to 65 planes in total in 1940. The Mitsubishi Zero was superior to anything found in China. In June 1941, the Chinese Air Force had 89 Polikarpov I-15 and I-16 planes, 70 Soviet light bombers, and 89 obsolete American planes like the pea shooter. In 1941, the situation changed, with Lend-Lease extended to China in spring. In 1942, Chinese air strengths were back at 337, but with casualties they only had 77 in June 1943. From 1937 to the end of the war, the US sent in China 244 bombers, 1,038 fighters, 15 recon planes, and 97 transports. But all of this went to the Chinese though. A lot of it went to American pilots in China, and the Chinese had about 500 planes at the end of the war. There were debates among the Western allies on how much resources to send to Europe versus the Pacific. Focus was on Europe first, and the Western Allied forces in Asia Pacific. In 1944, for example, 1,012 planes were sent to China versus 7,600 to the Soviet Union and 18,500 to the British. So indeed, a very slim part of Lend-Lease airplanes were going to Chiang. The Americans sent volunteers to help as soon as 1937. Claire Chennault accepted the offer to become air advisor to Chiang and train pilots. The American volunteer group was created in 1941 and became the China Air Task Force in 1942. At the beginning, they only had a handful of planes, but they destroyed hundreds of Japanese planes in a matter of months. A Chinese-American composite wing was created by Chennault in 1943, and Chinese pilots really performed well. Beginning in 1944, they began bombing Japanese troops everywhere in China and put them on the defensive. Its role was actually greater than the Chinese Air Force. In 1944, they flew twice the number of sorties, and in 1945 it was 7 times. While Chinese plane strengths were in the hundreds and Japanese war productions were in the tens of thousands, the US produced during the war 297,000 planes. In January 1942, the Americans had 3,537 frontline planes in the Pacific. In January 1943, they had more than 11,000. In January 1944, 18,000. And the next year, more than 20,000. It's hard to find numbers for Japanese aircraft losses by front, But if we look at specific battles, we can see their losses were bigger in the Pacific. They lost 683 at Guadalcanal, around 300 at Midway, around 600 at Philippine Sea in 1944, 100 at Rabaul in one day in November 1943, and 1,465 kamikazes died altogether. All of which is to say, there are no good numbers for Japanese plane strengths and losses, but the vast majority undoubtedly were in the Pacific. Even in China, the Americans were responsible for the most air kills. As mentioned, little of the Lend-Lease went to China, but for Chinese standards it was big. Since supply routes to Burma were closed, the Americans went to great pains to supply China by planes over the Himalayas, the famous hump. 1,000 men and 600 planes were lost doing that. It began in April 1942 and rose to 20,000 tons of supply per month, but in general it was only a few thousand tons per month. From 1942 to the end of the war, 650,000 tons were sent. Until the end, the Chinese depended on that for their operations. The Americans were so serious on this that when the urgent need arose, they took out important supply planes for operations in Burma to be sent in China. Apart from that, I mentioned General Stilwell was sent in 1942 to help command Chinese forces in Burma. He reorganized and equipped them as he could. As mentioned, the Soviets fought the Japanese in 1939 with 500,000 to 600,000 men and inflicted 20,000 to 25,000 military deaths. Afterwards, a treaty was signed, and the Soviets could concentrate on the Nazis. In 1945, they promised the Allies to enter the war against Japan 3 months after a victory day in Europe, and they did. They massed huge armies in Siberia and invaded Manchuria on August 9. The Soviets quickly took large swaths of territory, and the USSR fanboy teacher I mentioned in my first video said that the Red Army was a steamroller and quickly did what the US could not by seizing territory so fast. In truth, terrain in this region was easy to move on with better infrastructure, and the Japanese Kwantung Army was a paper tiger. On paper it had 700,000 men, 1,215 armored vehicles, and 1,800 planes. In reality, Japanese armor was mainly armored cars and light tanks from the 1930s, and planes were either training planes or obsolete. Japanese units were understrength, and their best units and equipment had been sent to the Pacific in the last 3 years. Essentially, it was a light infantry force for counterinsurgency. None of the divisions and brigades were rated combat ready, and some were at 15% capacity. After that, there was no direct threat to Japan from the Soviets. They didn't have the means to do an amphibious landing on Hokkaido. In 1945, they killed more than 21,000 Japanese troops by Japanese estimates, and almost 84,000 by Soviet estimates. Whose number is better? I don't know. And talking about the Soviets, we come to the last point of this video, the reasons why the Japanese surrendered. When you think about it, they were the most fanatical, but unlike the Italians and Germans, they surrendered before their territory was invaded. They still had a strong army of about 1 million men, and they were training civilians for defense, so why did they surrender? The Allies had laid out terms at Potsdam which were unacceptable to the Japanese unless they were put on their knees. Several reasons for the surrender are proposed. The classic one is the threat of more atomic bombings. Related to that are the effects of strategic bombings on cities in the prior months. Another one is the Soviets entering the war, but there are other factors. One thing to remember is, the Emperor, until the last minute, wasn't the one doing the big decisions. A military and political clique was calling the shots, and he could not have suddenly decided to stop the war unless part of the clique agreed with him. So let's examine each factor. The atomic bombs. After the first atomic bombing on Hiroshima on August 6, Japanese Foreign Minister Togo asked the Emperor to accept the Allies' Potsdam surrender terms. It was also there that the Emperor saw the futility of struggle. Strategic bombings, meanwhile, were never a large factor in victory against the Japanese or the Germans, unlike bombings on factories. And even those were not as efficient as bombings on Japanese supplies, as we'll see. Several people say the Soviet entry in the war was the true reason for the Japanese divisions and not the atomic bombings. It was this factor which made the Japanese army faction of the ruling clique accept the idea of surrender. The Japanese Navy was focusing on other factors but was politically weaker. Like we saw, however, Japanese troops in Manchuria were pathetic, and the Soviets could not invade the Japanese islands. What Japanese army leaders really feared was, if the Soviets could do this, imagine what the Americans with all their means could do to us. And in fact, the atomic bombings and the Soviet entry were more like cherries on the cake. A very important factor we don't often hear, but which is always a key for a war, is logistics and supply. Even if the Japanese had a large army, they saw they couldn't hold the main islands. As we saw, the US sank great numbers of merchant ships. 75% of goods and resources in Japan were imported. Their merchant fleet was relatively small and thus sensible to losses, and shipping production was limited. When the war began, they had 6 million tons of shipping and captured 4 million more in their conquests. In August 1945, they had 500,000 tons. The same applies for oil, the key for such an industrial war. They were reliant on reserves and production from their conquests, so as the Philippines were lost in 1944, they couldn't supply oil back to Japan. Airplanes in the Philippines could strike shippings in all critical lanes. The main factor in Japan's surrender for me was the American ability to destroy its war effort. The rest was a nail in the coffin. It was a combination of all this which brought everyone, except the war minister, to accept surrender terms. So there you have it. If I must summarize everything quickly, the Western Allies, especially the United States, did the most to win the war in Asia Pacific against Japan. The British and other allies had their part, the Soviets contributed twice in weakening the Japanese, and it's important to remember the sacrifice the Chinese made and what they endured to retain so many Japanese divisions in their territory. Even though what they inflicted on the Japanese was not proportional, it was substantial help nonetheless. Still, they were much less efficient than other countries. Their contribution to the air war was small, for the naval war was pretty much non-existent, and they depended in great part on the Americans for supplies. Japan was mainly beaten by the United States' ability to destroy its land and sea forces, its transports, and its overall war effort. Well, I hope you enjoyed this second part of my video. It took me a lot of free time to do it. There was less complete data than the previous video, but I think it was still fascinating learning everything while making this one. It's a topic we can't get enough, really. I have no idea what my next video will be about, so if you want me to cover some political or historical topic, I'd be glad. Until then, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you around.